Hi everyone, I wanted to talk for just a minute about an error that my students get every semester working with Python or VPython or really any sort of Python-based programming environment, and that's about inconsistent indentations. So first, before we get to inconsistent indentations, let's talk about why indentations are important in Python and what Python uses them for. So this is a web VPython code that depicts a ball. We're going to call it an amoeba so that we have a nice little application for our life science students that skitters across the runway here, the petri dish or the water measurement, whatever it is. And what ends up happening is we have this nice cool little animation loop. The way that animation happens is in this while loop down here. So we're going to focus most of our attention here in lines 20 through 31. So this is set up as a while loop. While means I want you to repeat the next chunk of code while t is less than tf. So t is initially set to 0, tf is initially set to 15. So we do have the case that 0 is less than 15, so this thing will run. At the end of the loop here, we increase t by an amount delta t. So this statement remains true until t gets to 15 seconds. So here at the end, we tell it to print t equals t final seconds. And we get to 15, and 15 is when it stops. The question is, how does Python know which lines to repeat and which lines to wait to do until the loop is finished? And the way it tells that is indentation. So you notice that lines 22 through 31 all have some white space to the left of them. They are indented, just like you would have if you were writing an essay. You might indent the first line of each paragraph. That's kind of an old school requirement. I think they still do that in some English programs, but you might do that, you might be taught to do that at some point in your education. But what you end up with is these little indentations here. And so Python is going to interpret those indentations as this chunk is part of the loop. This chunk is not. So lines 22 through 31 are going to get repeated. We're going to update the position, update the arrows, the arrow that's attached to this thing, and then we're going to update the time. And we're not going to print until we get to the end. So that's why it repeats the animation, and the amoeba makes a series of steps to the right, but we don't get to the printed piece until the very end. So what's the deal with inconsistent indentation? Well, let's suppose I wanted to add a little bit of information to this. Let's suppose I wanted to add a print command to tell me amoeba.position.x at each stage of the loop. I notice this is indented, and so that means it's going to print that x component every time the amoeba inches forward. But let's suppose I had an inconsistent indentation. How does this happen? Well, sometimes this happens because a student gets in here and either puts in one space instead of two, or they delete a space, or they put in an extra space, something like that. They're just not letting Python do the indentation for them. Because when you press enter, Python automatically continues the indentation there. But sometimes students miss that and they think they have to put the spacebar in themselves. And so what will happen when I run this, it gives me this error down here at the bottom, inconsistent indentation at line 31. Now what you notice, the inconsistent indentation is not actually at line 31. So let's unpack this for just a minute. The reason we got inconsistent indentation is because between these two lines, between 31 and 33, I have an inconsistent indentation. You notice that the T here is lined up two spaces to the right of the left margin of the screen. But this print statement got an extra space, or the same thing happens if I give it one space instead of two. Here you can really tell, here if I get rid of this line, you can really tell that these two are not aligned together. Basically, they need to form a nice vertical edge here, is what needs to happen. Now, the other reason to read this is it says at line 31. Well, the problem's not actually at line 31. The problem is between line 31 and line 32. It's just line 31 is where it noticed. I don't know what to do when I go to line 32. So the way to fix that is to just look at 31 and then the print statement and check to make sure that they are visually aligned with each other here between the leftmost margin and where they begin. Because the thing is, Python actually doesn't care how many spaces you give. Like I could give all of these lines one extra space, And Python actually doesn't care how many you give because it's not wrong indentation, it's inconsistent indentation. So everybody here has 3 spaces now, and the important thing is that it's consistent. They are all the same. It really doesn't matter how many there are, we just have to be consistent. So that's what inconsistent indentation means. It just means we've got a line somewhere that's not flush on the left-hand side with its neighbors. Here we get the error in line 29 because that's where it notices there's a problem on the next command. The way to fix that is just make sure everybody is lined up there on the left.